Good morning and welcome to today's event, Pulling Off an Energy Transition, a Roadmap for the Caribbean. I'm Jason Marzek, Senior Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, which houses the Caribbean Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you to everyone joining us virtually, including our speakers, who you'll hear from in just a few moments. I'd like to particularly thank our keynote speaker, Trinidad and Tobago's Minister of Energy and Energy Industries, Stuart Young, for taking the time to join us today. Mr. Young spoke at the launch of our Caribbean Energy Working Group, so it's only fitting and quite welcome that he join us today for the rollout of our new publication titled A Roadmap for the Caribbean's Energy Transition. At a time where energy prices were rising, and of course continue to have profound consequences on Caribbean economies, we made the timely decision to launch a Caribbean Energy Working Group last October. This is part of my personal dedication and that of the Atlantic Council overall to advancing Caribbean priorities in Washington and beyond, and why it led us at the Adrian Arsht Center to establish a specific initiative dedicated to highlighting Caribbean opportunities and challenges within our hemispheric mandate and as part of the global remit of the Atlantic Council. Our new Caribbean Initiative publication, which is now available for everyone to read, was a result of the working group's discussions. I'd like to personally thank the working group's co-chairs who are joining us as panelists today. David Goldwyn, chair of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's Energy Advisory Group, and Eugene Tia. Thank you for your leadership of this group, and you'll hear from both of them in a moment. The working group is a collection of Caribbean energy experts with significant expertise and experience at the policy and technical levels. Thanks to all of you who joined these discussions, which took place across Washington, Miami, and Trinidad and Tobago. Over the course of this group, I was pleased to travel 2 times to Trinidad and Tobago for these discussions. Throughout the working group's meetings, what became clear is that Caribbean countries do not have the resources, technical assistance, and technologies required to have reliable and affordable access to energy. This issue brief tackles this problem by building a 5-step roadmap that Caribbean governments and the region's partners can use to support an energy transition. The launch of this brief and the conversation we'll have today is growing in importance for the Caribbean. All over the world, countries are doubling down on their energy security and energy transition plans. Leaders emphasized these points during their speeches at the UN General Assembly just last week, and it will of course be a focal point at COP28 at the end of the year. But amid the growing attention to these energy issues, small island developing states like those in the Caribbean are being left behind. That can no longer continue. Our publication puts a spotlight on these countries and charts a realistic path forward. These issues and potential solutions will be the focus of our conversation today. Now I'll turn it over to Atlantic Council Board Member Melanie Chen for a few remarks and to introduce Mr. Young. Afterwards, Wasim Mullah, Associate Director of the Caribbean Initiative, will introduce the rest of the speakers and moderate the conversation. Melanie, thank you for all your partnership. Over to you.
Thank you, Jason. First, I'd like to thank all of the Caribbean Energy Working Group members for their participation and dedication over the past year. I'd also like to thank our speakers for taking time out of their day to join us for this important discussion. Energy security is a top priority for the Caribbean. As the founder of the Caribbean Initiative and the only Atlantic Council board member born in the Caribbean who also resides there, I can testify to the importance of this issue for the region. The functioning of economies and the development of emerging sectors are hinged to manageable electricity prices. We have seen this in areas like the travel and tourism industry, which is a major consumer of energy. But this sector, which most Caribbean countries are highly dependent on, struggles due to high electricity prices. These high prices also translate to average citizens and hinders potential economic growth. Lowering these prices by building competitive and resilient energy systems can underpin wide development across the region. Transitioning to power generation that is primarily renewable energy is one way to do this. However, an energy transition is costly and not always politically or technologically feasible. Simply, The Caribbean's energy transition needs to be realistic and occur in a way where citizens do not bear the brunt of the costs. This is a key point made in the Caribbean Initiative's new issue brief, which was released today. I encourage all watching to read it. To begin the conversation, we are joined by the Honourable Stuart Young, Minister of Energy and Energy Industries for Trinidad and Tobago. Minister, welcome and thank you for joining us. It was almost a year ago that Minister Young joined us, where we announced the formation of the Caribbean Energy Working Group. Since then, Minister Young and his government, along with countless others, have been important partners for the Caribbean Initiative's work. A practicing attorney, Minister Young was elected to Parliament in 2015. Since then, he has served in several ministerial capacities, including Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister and Minister of National Security. Since 2021, he has served as Minister of Energy and Energy Industries and has helped Trinidad and Tobago and the wider CARICOM region navigate global disruptions and change in the energy space. Minister Young, it is a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Melanie, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning to everyone who has taken time off of your invariably very busy day to be with us here this morning. In my few words and my few moments, allow me first of all to start by thanking the Atlantic Council, and in particular board member Melanie Chen, who is, and I'm going to claim her, a Trinidadian by birthright, for this very important work that you all have undertaken in the past year. I'd like to thank our co-chairs who led the teams of experienced and dedicated professionals, Eugene Tier and David Goldwyn, for the work that you would have done. I look forward to reading this roadmap and this report to see what it is that your year's work has come to conclusion with. The energy security in the Caribbean is very tied to climate change and the ill effects of climate change, which we face as small island states in the Caribbean, and even our CARICOM neighbors who are on the mainland CARICOM, for example, Suriname and Guyana, that face the battering of rising sea levels with their sea walls on their coastlines, etc. That is the first point I'd like to make, that it is important that we understand, and in particular the developing countries, the developed and wealthy countries understand that we, the small island states, are facing firsthand the ill atrocities of climate change and the effects of climate change. When you marry that with our need for energy security, and in particular the CARICOM regions, Trinidad and Tobago is very different to the rest of them in that 99.9% of our electricity generation is from our natural gas resources. But the rest of our CARICOM brothers and sisters, our nations, are in fact high priority list for their energy security. And they are at a transition point now where they have to take decisions as to what would generate their power needs for decades to come. Of course, the world is moving more towards renewables, with the high cost of renewables and sometimes the need for a basket of renewables because the sun isn't always shining and the wind is not always blowing. The geothermal hasn't been properly developed in some of these islands. When you marry that with the small populations, the topic of bankability, feasibility, and financial ability to finance these types of projects that will provide energy security are very, very difficult for small populations of under 100,000, under 200,000 persons. And exactly as was outlined at the beginning by the two prior speakers, one of the difficulties is that you cannot have small populations carry the high costs of energy security and this transformation in power generation. I'd also like to take this opportunity to just put on the table our thanks to the United States government, for it was in June of last year at the Summit of the Americas when President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris met with the leaders of CARICOM and decisions were taken for the emphasis that has been placed on the CARICOM region. And one of the bodies that came out of that meeting, and those very important conversations in June of last year, was a body to drive energy security. There were also bodies to drive food security and also financial transitioning and de-risking. Prime Minister Rowley, Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, was named the co-chair of the body on energy security, and I was in turn deputized by him, and I've been working very closely with Anna and her team, and I'd like to thank you all for listening to us and for the work that you've done. A year may seem a long time to many, but we know that that matter of months has not been that long. We are desperate in this area and in this region to find the ability to be able to finance these projects, and that is one of the things we've been talking about. I'm really looking forward to the work that has been done, but also the continued support of the US government in this important topic for us that is a reality. Because of course, whilst we're taking the battering from the global climate change and dealing with increasing flooding, increasing coastal erosion, and very unpredictable weather, that also includes heat that we have not felt for centuries, I'm told. We require the help of our friends, and there's no closer ally in this hemisphere than the United States. Having said that, I will begin my conclusion by saying it is also important that you recognize the ability of countries such as Trinidad and Tobago and others to work with our neighboring countries in South and Latin America to provide energy security in forms that are possible, for example, with the proven reserves right next door to Trinidad and Tobago, and our ability to take proven gas reserves and convert it into important commodities that are needed globally, including in our region. So, in conclusion, I'd like to thank Atlantic Council. I'd like to thank, in particular, your board member, Melanie Chen, who took the time, the effort, and has worked tirelessly over the past year and before, not only on providing the funding and the impetus and the encouragement for this report that we're about to hear about, and for the important work done in the energy sector, and for Atlantic Council to continue doing the work that they're doing. Please don't underestimate the region. Please don't underestimate CARICOM, and in particular, the various individual countries that make up CARICOM. We may be small, but we've been punching above our weight belt for a very long time, not only in the energy sector, but in other areas. I look forward to the continuation of the work with Atlantic Council, and importantly, with the US government as we drive forward. And your work is critical in finding solutions for this region's energy security issues and problems, especially at this transition point when many islands, as you're aware now, are making those decisions as to their power generation for decades to come. Eugene, David, thank you to your teams. I know Mark Loquan also participated, and many others. It is very much appreciated. And I ask that you all continue to do the good work that you're doing. You have the full support of Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular myself as an individual for as long as I'm here. And in conclusion, I look forward to reading your great work and continuing to work with all of you in the various ways that we must, and to be aware of the work that you're doing and the lives that you're possibly going to transform. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Minister Young, for those excellent remarks and for taking the time out of your day to participate with us, not just in this event, but when we launched the Energy Working Group almost a year ago. It's great to have you. Your insights remain crucial to our work here and the Caribbean Initiative, especially in the energy space. Also, thank you to Jason and Melanie for both of your remarks at the top of the program, and to everyone that is tuning in virtually. As Jason and Melanie shared, today's conversation is important for the health and well-being of the region. We're seeing global changes in the energy space as more and more countries adopt clean energy technologies, and geopolitics continues to drive energy prices. Where the Caribbean fits in this scenario is quite uncomfortable. Their import-dependent nature means that volatile or increasing energy costs at global levels has a disproportionate effect on the region. At the same time, as Minister Young mentioned, the region is affected by the effects of climate change. This is the circumstance that the region finds itself in, and why our Caribbean Energy Working Group has tackled these issues with such urgency. As a reminder, our issue brief that Minister Young and others have mentioned is now live on the Atlantic Council website, and we'll touch on many of the challenges that the issue brief touches on, but we'll also look at other issues that are relevant to the issue brief's topics. We'll look at the current standing of the Caribbean Energy's matrix and the main challenges the region faces in achieving its transition. We'll talk then about how countries can balance an energy transition with energy security. And we'll end the discussion by looking at what opportunities there are for partners of the Caribbean, including the United States, to help facilitate a transition and achieve energy security. So to discuss these topics, we have a great group of distinguished speakers joining us. First, we have one of our Caribbean Energy Working Group co-chairs, David Goldman, who is president of Goldman Global Strategies and is chair of the Global Energy Center's Energy Advisory Group here at the Atlantic Council. David has also served in numerous government capacities, including the U.S. State Department Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs. David, it's so great to have you here and to have worked with you over the past year. Also, next, we have Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation at the Department of State, Anna Schwitzberg. Schwitzberg, it's great to have you here. She's responsible for supporting a shift to a decarbonized economy that enables secure and resilient energy systems. She's played a substantial role in the energy transition goals of the Caribbean over her time in government, and has also served previously as Director for Global Power and Renewables at IHS Markit. Thank you for joining us once again. Last but not least, we have Alicia Chaler, who is joining us. Alicia is the Investment Management Lead Officer at the Infrastructure and Energy Division at IDB Invest. Alicia is also a member of our Caribbean Energy Working Group and was specifically instrumental in developing some of the steps, a part of the 5-step roadmap that has been discussed in the issue brief. So thank you all for joining us. We have a great discussion that we're going to have. So first, I want to kick off a question to all of you. Start with David, then go to Dash Schwitzberg, and then over to you, Alicia. From each of your perspectives, what does the Caribbean's energy matrix look like today? And how is that differing by country or by sub-region in the Caribbean? What countries are dependent on oil and gas, and which are having more and more of a focus on clean energy? So David, first I'll kick it off to you and then go to Dash Schwitzberg.
Great, thanks, Waz, and thanks also to Eugene Tia, who is with us today also, and we've learned a great deal from this task force and the deep expertise, not only from the minister and from Melanie, but from a really robust group that we worked with. I want to focus on sort of 3 things that we took away from this report. The first is that the region, as you've heard, is desperately in need of an energy transition. Certainly high electricity costs. I think some countries in the region pay 3 times what we pay here in the United States, which is devastating for tourism industry. They're highly vulnerable to extreme weather, as we saw in the devastation wreaked on Dominica, from the storms there. The energy grids, the electricity grids, are severely undercapitalized in many places and not resilient to these kinds of storms. And government budgets are pretty highly stressed by high fossil fuel prices. The region imports, outside of Trinidad, 87%, of its fossil fuels. And really only the Southern Caribbean, with the fossil fuel resources, attracts significant investment. So the second insight we have is that if you're going to have an energy transition, you really need an energy transformation. And that really goes to the need to transform the electricity grids and the utility models. You cannot introduce significant amounts of renewable energy unless you have the capacity to receive them. And the grids in some cases are vertically integrated, they are undercapitalized, and we have to find ways to finance that transition in order to be able to make these kinds of changes. And it's a big chicken and egg problem because investors don't want to invest significant amounts in large renewable energy projects unless they know they can wheel that electricity, and the countries need to know that you're not going to destabilize the grid. So we have some recommendations on how to deal with that. The third insight really is that the incremental approach, which has characterized the past 2 decades, which is a project by project basis, really has not made significant or enough progress. Right now, we have only 11% of installed capacity in the region from renewable energy. So we really need to scale up. And so what we've recommended in our 5-step program, is really modeling for each country to figure out where storage and efficiency and renewables fit into the system, but also resilience and redundancy. Second, we need investment, both technical assistance and financing, to modernize these grids and to diversify these utility structures. And then we really need a lot of external support to create bankable projects, to get past the valley of death from ideas to project financing. This ground has been trod before, but we're talking about funds to do that. And finally, to have some frameworks at scale so that we're not doing 1 or 2 projects, but we can attract investors to do large ones. So we can get into the roadmap but we had basically ballparked the cost of this transformation based on an IMF report at $5 to $7 billion. So given COP28 and the kinds of dollars that are being talked about for Africa and for other parts of the world, this is relatively small dollars on a global scale. And so we think the time is ripe right now for that kind of transformation. And we think on a, on a global level, it's quite affordable.
Thank you, David. A great overview of the report. And again, I encourage everyone to take a look at it after this event. Stuart, I want to go to you for the same question, but can you provide maybe more of a global context? So we understand, from previous remarks of some of the challenges and what the energy matrix looks like in the Caribbean, but how does that differ or compare to other regions in the world? And what are maybe some lessons learned that we can take from that?
Sure. And second, in terms of the dynamics that David mentioned, and actually, first off, thank you all. Wonderful to be here at the Atlantic Council and with Minister Young, who's been a fantastic partner. And it's great to see this report and truly really do second a lot of the comments that were made. We see the same dynamics. We see an over 85% dependency on imported fossil fuels, which costs over $7 billion a year. And I don't think there's a country out there that wouldn't want to reduce that and be able to use some domestic clean energy resources. And that's just the reality. There's also the reality that these are different countries and they have different mixes and different needs. And so we do have oil and gas resources that are being explored or used in Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, in Suriname. And the interesting change we see today, and I want to make sure I talk to the Caribbean, the differentiation we see in the Caribbean before I go outside of it. Because what we see isn't that different in terms of what where they're hoping to get to. And that is interest in hydrogen, interest in CCUS, interest in methane abatement, because there's a climate and supply impact. And there's an eye toward next generation technologies and addressing emissions, but also competitiveness and where these companies can sit in the future energy market world. And we see it also in terms of clean energy deployment, which is widespread in the region, whether it's exploring opportunities to utilize geothermal that can fully decarbonize an economy with baseload renewables. St. Kitts and Nevis has them, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Guadeloupe. We're seeing a lot of action on renewable tenders. We could see significantly more. So recently there was a public tender launched by Jamaica for 100 megawatts with a plan to launch another 170 early this year. The launch of pilot programs like Barbados, which has a pilot program on battery storage, which aligns with its renewable goal. And so we're seeing these same motivations everywhere in the world, and we see them very alive and real. With that said, when we look outside in terms of comparing to other regions, it is a much stronger dependency that results in incredibly high cost of energy, particularly electricity, than we would see anywhere else. And this means, one, there's a significant incentive to find an alternative, and there are a number of alternatives that result in cost savings. And not all alternatives are for generation. Some have to do with operational efficiency improvements. Many are options that are just viable because of that cost differential. The difficult part is that because of the high energy costs, island nations face much higher budgetary pressure. And so it's not always easy to absorb that new debt. And of course, they're dealing with the need to pay for climate effects more often, which strains that a lot more, to Minister Young's point. So these are things that we need to deal with. And of course, we need to deal with the cost of financing, because we look at LCOE's, levelized cost of energy, across the world, and there's also a differential, not in terms of just what's being paid today, but what those new technologies bring. And it all comes down to soft costs. It comes down to financing, comes down to the risks that are being attributed to specific regions. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Jasper, for great comments as well. Alicia, I want to turn to you. You have a really unique perspective from IDB Invest, and of course, being from the region. We'd love to get your own perspective on the energy matrix in the Caribbean right now, and particularly what might be facing different islands.
Sure. Thank you, Waz, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for inviting me. And I want to echo some of what David and Anna just said. It's very true. The Caribbean context is quite different. We are coming up a learning curve when it comes to renewable energy. You're looking at the majority of the Caribbean that is dependent on fossil fuels, oil and gas. I think the two countries that may not be as dependent might be Belize and Suriname. but Suriname is only 26% renewable energy, but Belize is at about 45% of renewable energy. But you have to also look at where the Caribbean is in its whole cycle. It is at a point where, for example, countries like Guyana and Suriname are now having greater discoveries of oil and gas, but they have to also combine having a proper energy matrix, right? They are not the major contributors of carbon dioxide, but of course, the Caribbean is heavily affected by climate change, as the minister said earlier. So I think that the areas that we have to focus on is on policy and legislation framework to ensure that there's the enabling environment for renewable energy. There are some countries like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago that already have an auction process, but a lot of the other countries do not. Countries like Trinidad and Tobago, again, Barbados and Jamaica, they have certain template PPAs now that they can use that can help on other projects going forward. But there's a lot to be done. One, from upskilling of the overall human resources, capacity building, and support financially, both from a financing standpoint and from a technical assistance standpoint, which is basically donor funding. You need bigger and large scale projects to really make a dent in terms of the NDCs that each country has committed to under the Paris Agreement. And so there needs to be a very systematic approach to transitioning to the renewable energy system.
Thank you, Alicia. Great comments on policy and legislation framework, template PPAs that can be used, upskilling human resources. I want to stay with you really quickly and maybe dive into specific challenges, right? David at the top talked a little bit about some of the challenges that we envision as a working group in the issue brief, but can you talk specifically a little bit about the challenges to project development and project finance, right? During our working group sessions, you talked a lot about what are the components, what it means to build a bankable project. How do you de-risk a project? So we'd love to get your standpoint on what that looks like in the region.
Sure. So firstly, I would say there are not a lot of large-scale projects, renewable energy projects in the Caribbean. You have the Paradise Park project in Jamaica. You have the microgrid project also in Jamaica with Soleco, but not a lot of utility scale. There's the Trinidad and Tobago Lara Solar project. And that project actually was financed by the sponsors themselves through total equity, which was BP and Shell. But then again, it's BP and Shell. You're not going to have a lot of other sponsors that have those deep pockets to actually finance through equity. So what you're looking at for most projects is you're going to need debt financing. And in order to get debt financing and to get other equity stakeholders to inject into the project, you need to have a bankable project, which means that you need to have experienced EPC contractor, O&M contractor as well. You need to have a robust power purchase agreement in place. The requisite skills level on the sponsors team to negotiate the project. I've seen a number of projects that have come to us where, you know, people want to do, for example, wind energy, but they don't have the requisite experience in the team. And they think it's something that's pretty straightforward, but it's not. As a lender, as an equity injector, you need to know that you're going to get the return on your investment. So the fundamentals of the project, meaning the projections, the financial model, the revenue stream generated from the project needs to be sound. And there needs to be very sound underlying assumptions for the projections. You also need to ensure that there's attractive pricing, that after you factor in all of the costs for the project, it is an actually viable project. And I think some of the areas that we see too is that in certain technologies, for example, in green hydrogen, you're using an electrolyzer. This is not something that has been widespread. It's not an absolutely new technology at all. but they're not electrolyzers in abundance. So the cost of an electrolyzer is quite high. And so in order to make green hydrogen, which is used from renewable energy to create green hydrogen, to then sell to off-takers to produce, for example, green ammonia or green methanol, you need to have a project where there's a combination of equity and debt financing, but also other products like blended finance, which is lower cost financing, to help to make the project bankable and feasible.
Thank you, Alicia. And all of those points, of course, are covered in the issue brief. Dash Pittsburgh, I want to go to you now. We talked a little bit about, Alicia gave a great overview, and so did David, on some of these challenges in the region. Now, from the U.S. standpoint, from the U.S. government and also U.S. private sector companies, what are some of the challenges that they encounter working in the region, and what are some of the things maybe the region might need to do to support and help facilitate greater engagement here?
Yeah, I don't think it's that different. So late last year and in early February, we sent multi-agency U.S. government teams on scoping missions to the region to identify with our partners the best way to help increase the use of clean energy. And not surprisingly, they found the greatest obstacle is often not the project funding, but rather the lack of regulatory frameworks, project evaluation, capacity to integrate renewables into the grid more effectively, and some of the issues that Alicia mentioned. It's the reason that within PAC 2030, our partnership with the Caribbean, we are focusing our attention at the front end of the project development pipeline, which includes supporting those regulatory frameworks and the technical capacity to actually issue, process, and adjudicate clean energy tenders in a competitive and transparent way. Because if we step back, those frameworks lay the guidelines for the tender. And if the tender matches the energy plan, it's a lot easier for companies to understand their risk and ideally not pass it on as a high financing requirement, because often it's not pricing for risk, but it's pricing for the unknown, and the unknown is risky. And we got to be able to differentiate that a bit. We also deal with the challenge of adding debt, making a difference on the ability to offer guarantees, and then the ability for blended finance to move in and out. So it is a combination of debt, the commercial viability of a project in terms of how it fits within the country plan, and how de-risked it is structurally. And the impact on interest rates as a result are the issues that we need to work together to overcome. Now, there's a timing / operational utilization issue as well that comes up often with the companies. David mentioned this up front. In the short term, many countries are relying on these very old and efficient diesel plants that are ready for retirement. But because clean power projects are not yet operational, these plants can't be retired. And there isn't this clear timeline. And often what adds to the cost is the drag on the timeline to negotiate for pricing. And in some cases, these plants require additional financing to either extend their operating lifespan or to replace them. Once financing goes to extend an asset, it makes it more difficult to justify a new asset because the utilization may not run as high. And that also impacts the pricing conversation. And this has been a prevalent issue we've seen with companies in the region. And the last thing I'll mention, which is probably obvious for this crowd, is the lack of economies of scale, which is driving up project costs. And so the interconnecting countries would help, but this costs money and would be easier to market and justify with large generation projects online. It's a pervasive chicken and egg interconnection challenge. But with that said, there is recognition that solutions become more feasible once they're scaled across islands. And that is why there has been such an active conversation on interconnection and regional solutions over the years. What we have to figure out how to do on that economies of scale challenge is recognize that these are different countries, and to be able to combine the needs of every country is very difficult. So we need to focus on what is the easiest, lowest hanging fruit to getting to a regional solution that is understanding of those differences. It doesn't pretend it can happen in a snap and it's very easy, but really takes advantage of the fact that we can build economies of scale, that these islands do have commonalities, and that there is interest in these islands. It's really hard to sit on projects with long timelines when you're talking about small scale. Usually companies are okay going in and taking additional risk when they see future tenders coming out. So if those future tenders can be part of a bigger pool, I think that would make it a lot easier.
Thank you, Dash Pittsburgh. Great points. And quickly, I want to introduce the other co-chair of our Caribbean Energy Working Group. We had a bit technical difficulty, but he's able to join us now, Eugene Tia, formerly with Massey Energy as executive chairman of the Business and Gases Unit, but has also served as president of Amtram in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago. Eugene, it's great to have you, and definitely want to offer you an opportunity to provide some comments. And we talked a little bit about some of the specific challenges to the energy transition in the Caribbean and energy security. But one thing we haven't really touched on too much is the utility sector. David mentioned at the top these top-down vertically integrated utility business models, and this is something we talked a lot about in the Energy Working Group session. So we'd love to get some of your thoughts there. And then David, we'll go to you for your comments on utilities as well, but also to talk a little bit about these issues of economies of scale. I know you have some great comments that you mentioned in the working group. We'd love to get you there first. But Eugene, please, thanks for joining us, and please go ahead.
Could you hear me clearly?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. I'm a technical person and I struggled with my camera. I went through every troubleshooting action and worked with IT, and I'm stumped. So that doesn't maybe, kind of telling you that, technical capabilities need to continuously evolve. So thanks for the opportunity to say a few comments. Yes, I mean, with regard to vertically integrated, I mean, very few of the Caribbean countries actually have segmented their chains. And you have few countries that actually have separated generation from distribution and transmission. And these are real obstacles, right? I mean, the countries that have advanced some work in this area, Jamaica in particular, has done really good job. And maybe, as we talk about some of these challenges, particularly with vertically integrated chains and the opportunities to learn from countries that have advanced along that pathway already. So as we went through our sessions, what became quite apparent is probably the underutilization of the lessons that have been learned from countries that have made a lot more progress in advancing. So particularly, again, back to vertically integrated chains, unlocking the barriers there or surmounting the barriers there, I think could be accelerated. There are many challenges, as we had identified in the working groups, as to how important these vertically integrated chains are to the governments. I mean, some things that were big ahas to me, who comes from the private sector, were the revenues that small countries generate from the existence and the continuation of these models. So some of these things are going to be a bit challenging to address, but I think we have really good examples of countries that have confronted them, so to speak, in terms of how they were creating barriers for themselves and have unlocked them through a very systematic process. And I keep returning to the example of Jamaica. Trinidad, I think, is behind Jamaica in terms of how far it has advanced in that regard.
Thank you, Eugene. And of course, diversifying utility structure is step 3 of our 5-step roadmap. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that. David, want to come to you now if you want to address utilities a little bit. Perhaps also one thing we haven't talked about too much on is decentralized generation, looking at grid modernization writ large. And then we'll take the conversation to start looking a little bit about this balance between energy transition and energy security. David, over to you.
Thanks, Waz. And I just want to say, completely agree with what Anna and Alicia have laid out, and Eugene, in terms of the kinds of challenges that that need to be addressed. And I guess I would say I would focus on 3 in addition. The first is this utility question that everyone has talked about. I'm sympathetic to the utilities in the Caribbean because they are responsible for providing reliability and resilience and 24/7 electricity, and they are locked into long-term contracts, which are fossil-based. And the reality is that no one is stepping up to compensate them for investing in new infrastructure and for taking that risk. And what we have learned over the course is that cleaner energy is not necessarily cheaper energy, maybe over the long run, but not in the short run. And so, you need to create the political conditions for utilities to make this change, which is why we sort of recommend buying down some of the value death costs, providing credit support, not just debt, and providing and having a focus on utility diversification. The second big challenge, and we've talked about it a bit, is that small island states are not very attractive investment destinations for a number of reasons. The kit isn't there, everything has to be imported, but you don't have the ability to scale up. Offshore wind, no one wants to build, to do a one and done project. They want to be able to build, 3 or 4. And so it's not like Brazil or Chile or Mexico where you have a big growth path. So that means you have to find a way to scale up. And that's why we looked at some other models. They don't fit completely, but like Renovar in Argentina, and what now their green map is called RELP now, but what they're doing in Jamaica. But the idea that you need a national framework, even if it's an island state framework, that applies to many projects, that provides those fiscal conditions that Alicia was talking about, so that more than one project developer sees confidence in what they want to do going forward. And that's why we think to get to scale, not project by country, and maybe eventually to region, and to a regional scale, if we can get through national scale, is really important, because without that national kind of framework, it's still going to be project by project. But the third real challenge here, and this is a donor challenge, is that we have to have realistic expectations on the part of donor governments about what's possible, because energy security, affordability in these countries means that you have to deal with intermittency. You can't afford grid scale battery storage yet, and they're going to need a resource. And if you're going to decarbonize from kerosene and diesel, you're probably talking about gas. And we've talked about this in the report. There are ways to do transitional power, as is done in northern Mexico and southern California. So maybe for a decade, you have gas-fired generation to back up the renewable generation, and then you phase it out when we make enough progress in batteries to be able to do that. But donor governments are very reluctant to invest in that kind of resilience if it involves gas. And I think it is unfair as well as unrealistic to say to Caribbean governments that you need to go to 100% renewables when the technology just isn't there yet. So I think, having a resilience framework, which decarbonizes the economies, is really important, but a broader view on what can be supported by donor governments, I think is a real challenge that needs to be overcome, because we're talking about hybrid systems, at least for the next decade, if not for the next 2 decades, which are increasing renewables as they decrease fossil-based, but it's still hybrid. And for a lot of these countries, that energy security and affordability really depends on having a hybrid system. So I'd say, to overcome that third challenge, a little more flexibility on the part of donor governments is really going to be essential.
Thanks, David. And I think it's a great segue for me to bring in Dash Pittsburgh. Would love to hear the U.S. position on this, right? How are current or potential changes in global energy markets shaping the balance between an energy transition and what is also energy security? And how do you envision this might impact engagement with the Caribbean?
Sure. Well, first off, I should note that we definitely see complementarity between energy security and energy transition. One, because climate is a security issue, and 2, because energy transition provides security and diversification benefits. The EU is feeling this right now, given the drastic shift they needed to make away from Russia, and they addressed this by not only alternating where their gas supply came from, but they also drastically decreased their natural gas demand and added 50 gigawatts of renewables. And 3, clean tech is the tech of the future. So to be a part of the energy market in a way that benefits the people, we all need to find a way to leverage this shift. And it's the reason that we have provided such large investments into commercial and non-commercial technologies for the transition through our legislation, and we've prioritized it with policy. And with all that said, it does not mean that geopolitics and volatility in supply do not strain the coffers, and as a result, make it harder to implement those energy plans. It also does not mean that we can take an energy system that has taken 100 years to turn over its dominant primary energy fuel in a snap of a finger. So what our ideal situation is that short-term thinking does not cloud planning behind better long-term solutions. And that means ensuring there is immediate supply while being very thoughtful about new infrastructure and its true cost. I often point out that we pay over $100 billion a year in the US to recover from natural disasters. And I do that because it's a cost that we don't see on the energy side, but is impacted. And it's an externality. And this cost is increasing with time. So it's very expensive to ignore climate change. And what I see now is that we've finally broken the $1 trillion investment line for clean energy, but it's a concentrated investment. And so we need to work on making it spread for the benefit of a lot of other economies and security around the world. We can't just focus inward. And so we have to be careful in terms of the trade-off with that funding. Caribbean countries are not any different. They're thinking about the future. They're thinking about ways to secure their market. And from a policy standpoint, for us, it's about taking a close look about, is there an alternative? If there's not an alternative, and the alternative is a more efficient, less carbon intensive fossil fuel, that of course will be considered, but it's not something that should be blanketly assumed. For example, for some countries that do have hydro resources and have some solar and have geothermal potential that covers more than their island, they're fine. That's a legitimate base you can sit on. For those that have identified how battery storage can be integrated with blended finance, and they have other facilities already, some that are running on low utilization but fossil, and others that are running at high utilization and increasing renewables, and they're adjusting their grid to it, there's a possibility. And then there are other situations and other islands that cannot adjust as easily, and they will be considering other options. But much of the policy is about thinking twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times about the actual cost of that decision making and how long it lasts. I talked about before the fact that just that chicken and egg problem of figuring out whether to extend an asset or whether to put in a new one. It's not easy to come off quickly. There needs to be an incentive. So unless someone usually pays to retire early, it's going to be hard to change that. So it's more about thinking about that decision twice and figuring out where that's a necessity and where that just is the more traditional solution that we're used to.
Thank you. And that's a great transition. We talked a lot about some of the challenges throughout this conversation. And it's only fitting that we now talk a little bit about the opportunities. And I think you've laid out a good spectrum for us to consider, not just now, but hopefully in the coming weeks and also in the next phase of where we take our Caribbean Energy Working Group. Alicia, on that point, I want to bring you in. Where are some of the opportunities that you see in the Caribbean to help facilitate this energy transition, help with energy security from IDB Invest, but also bringing in the role of the private sector? We'd love to go to you, and then I'll go to David and Eugene as well. Alicia?
Sure. I mean, I think the private sector has a pivotal role to play in the energy transition. You really can't expect governments to do it all. It's not going to happen. And I think the private sector is actually very willing to participate. There are a lot of developers that want to do large-scale projects. Again, the enabling environment is required. The financing as well, there are numbers.
So I think we may have had a just slight Wi-Fi. Alicia, can you hear us?
Are you hearing me now?
We are, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think people think that there is not sufficient financing out there from the financial institutions, but I think that there are quite a number of financial institutions, multilateral development banks included, that have the financing to deploy. But all of this end-to-end is required for a project to actually get off the ground. I think one of the positives, as we mentioned a little earlier amongst us, the speakers, is that you have certain countries that are ahead of the game. And I think what you need to do is use some of those lessons learned in other countries. Don't recreate the wheel. And so, for example, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, they have bankable PPAs in place. There needs to be more collaboration as well amongst Caribbean countries. Caribbean countries also have to develop their own strategies and plan, their integrated resource and resilience plans. And it needs to make sense. It's based against what you have decided are your nationally determined contributions and how you're going to get to those targets. And I think multilateral development banks also play a role there in supporting governments with that. And on the IDB Invest side, where I sit, where we support the private sector, we can also support in helping countries to develop their PPAs. because there are going to be certain nuances as well to a PPA for a solar or wind versus a green hydrogen. And we, as a multilateral development bank, have provided support, for example, to the Fair Trade Commission in Barbados to help them to develop a bankable PPA. The version that we saw really wasn't shovel ready. And so what we did is we used our internal expertise to opine on the PPA. We brought in an experienced New York lawyer that did work for us pro bono on the power purchase agreement. And now they have a PPA that is bankable. Now, at times, countries will not take all of the recommendations from the MDB and the lawyers, and that's not something that we can force. But at least it's in a lot better shape than when it first started. So I think that there's a lot that can be done to help in this transition. I think information sharing, knowledge sharing, lessons learned, collaboration through the private sector and with the financial institutions to work together towards achieving this energy transition in the Caribbean.
Thanks, Alicia. And excellent comments on the private sector and the role of MDBs. Eugene, want to go to you next before we close with David. Eugene, what is your perspective? What are some of the opportunities in the region to help facilitate the energy transition? I think what we've heard is that there are partner nations like the U.S. government that are on board. There are MDBs that are on board. Private sector is slowly coming on board, and it seems like we have all the components. So how do we make that happen? I'll turn it over to you, and then David, I'll come to you for the same question.
Yeah. Thanks, Waz. I'm really bought into this 5-step plan that will be available soon to the broader audience. But I think that really getting the CARICOM countries' governments on board with a plan like that and getting them bought in, I think is a critical step. I mean, we talk about potential donors, we talk about multilateral financing agencies and the enabling frameworks, etc. But I think equally important is to get the CARICOM countries, or the countries that we have looked at, fully on board with one approach that they could all buy into and are fully committed to. I think that's a critical enabler for us to go forward in a way that we don't have continuous looping back or friction to moving forward. The other that I'll speak a little bit about, because I heard quite a bit about gas, I think that, I understand the importance of doing all of the assessments, etc. But I think the Caribbean is well positioned to enable gas to be a transition fuel, so to speak, and to enable, sufficient time to elapse to have renewables supplant them ultimately. But if you look at the infrastructure in the Caribbean now, there is a lot of infrastructure that occurred on the larger islands that create a fairly excellent platform for small scale, more efficient small scale distribution. So there are, flows that have developed over time, not necessarily with the intention of serving the smaller Caribbean states, that now create this enabling infrastructure to make things possible that were not previously possible. So I think revisiting projects within that context may show quite different results in terms of the cost efficiencies associated with considering gas projects that enable, some time to be bought for more substantial renewable transition. So those two key points, getting the Caribbean countries on board with one plan, fully committed to the plan, and then as well and committing resources to be able to advance the plan, as well as going back to taking a closer, harder look at gas as a transition fuel and really putting a lot of significant effort there. Again, you'll need a lot of collaboration from the Caribbean countries.
Thank you, Eugene. Point well taken. The region working together is always important, not just on energy, but on a number of issues. And it also speaks to a little bit to Alicia's point, where if countries are at different stages, then they can definitely help each other. One of our big objectives at the Caribbean Initiative is helping the region be much more self-sufficient. So anytime the region can help itself, I think is always important. David, want to go to you for some final comments on what are the opportunities, and if I could throw in one final question there, looking out into the future, 10, 20 years, where is the Caribbean ideally, especially in its energy situation?
Well, let me take your second question first. God willing, for all of us, 10 to 20 years from now, we'll be in a world where we have grid scale battery storage, which can hold renewable energy for weeks and months, not hours and days. And you will have a completely sustainable and resilient Caribbean, as well as, frankly, for the rest of us, if the technology is out there, or at least you'll have hybrid systems, which will be radically decarbonized from where they are now. So if the technology and financing is there, that's what will be. But I would say on the opportunity, I think the biggest opportunity for the Caribbean is COP28. We're going to have a global stocktake, which will show how far off we are from reaching our 2050 goals. I fear there will be very little progress on loss and damage, and therefore there'll be an enormous amount of sympathy for the victims of climate change, particularly island states in the Caribbean and the Pacific. I think the likeliest element of progress at COP28 are going to be some very large checks, which are going to get written to help promote, the deployment of renewable energy and clean energy in the global South, in part to compensate for the lack of progress for things like GFANs, where all the banks were going to invest in net zero. And I think you could call that guilt or responsibility or whatever it is, but I think the time is going to be right for the developed world to step up with some very significant financing to help solve the problems of the developing world. And I think that with the kind of price tag that we are estimating for a transformation for the entire region, we have the ability to go from the very retail, laborious project support, the way Alicia has described in detail, to dealing with things at the national and maybe at the sub-regional level. And so I think there's a great opportunity now. It will take the United States and other donor countries saying the Caribbean is a priority, that money should be going to the Caribbean as well as to Africa and to other parts of the world, and to get behind, if not the programs we've suggested, the kinds of programs we have suggested, which is taking this money, using existing institutions, significantly ramping up both the technical foundational support needed for projects, and then equity and other kinds of support needed to do the financing, and to finally move this problem from something that we're talking about and dealing with incrementally to something that we're dealing with at scale. I think the opportunity is ripe, and I just hope we make the most of it.
Thank you, David. Excellent comments to close. I would like to thank everyone for joining us virtually. Thank you to Melanie and Jason for your remarks at the top, and to Minister Young for your keynote remarks. As always, it's great to have you at an event and to work with you, and we look forward to doing so in the future. Thank you to our speakers, specifically our co-chairs of our Caribbean Energy Working Group, David and Eugene. Dash Pittsburgh, you're a regular at the Atlantic Council now, and I hope that continues. Alicia, not just for speaking here, but also for your help on the report. Special thank you also to Mark Loquan and Dale Ramlakan, who helped with significant portions of the report as well. And of course, to Charlene, who is working at the Caribbean Initiative and helped put this event together. Thanks to everybody for joining, and looking forward to the next event.
So.